All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you to Saviors or Scams. My name is Jack Delarusso. I am a 1L PILC representative with the University of Oregon, and I will be moderating this panel. I just have a few announcements, and then we will get started with the panel. The first is a tech warning. Don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar. So all the attendees are automatically muted with videos off, and you will only be able to see the panelists. Also, throughout this panel, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. All of our panelists will be giving their presentations, and then there will be a 15-minute Q&A session at the end where the panelists will answer your questions. Please remember to be courteous of all viewpoints throughout the presentation and Q&A session. Additionally, if there are any legal professionals in the audience wanting to earn CLE credit for the panel, we will shortly post a link for you to register and pay on the JOT form. If you haven't registered, please do so. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships. If you are interested in making a donation to help provide students with those stipends, information to do so will be on a Google document, which we will drop the link to in the chat. Lastly, the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya land, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities. At UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon, PILC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. I will now transfer over to our primary panelist, Fergus McLean, and allow him to give an introduction.
Thank you, Jack. Oregonians live in one of planet Earth's great forests. Forest management has been central to our economic lives, with Oregon being the nation's top producer of lumber. Forest management is expensive. The cost of fire management and suppression and road maintenance alone require significant investment. Historically, privately owned forests, which do not produce adequate revenue to cover these basic costs, will be converted to other uses and disappear. Forests are nature's greatest terrestrial storehouses of biological carbon. Yet traditional forest economics places no monetary value on this forest carbon storage capacity. The prospect of landowners receiving compensation for their forest's capacity to store carbon through delaying or avoiding harvest promises the potential for a fundamental shift in the way we experience and relate to our forests, as we learn to practice forest management based on ecological integrity rather than lumber extraction alone. This is the promise of placing an economic value on forest carbon storage through monetization and market exchange of forest carbon offset credits. Yet early efforts to create such a system of forest carbon offset markets have received often justified criticism for ineffectiveness, manipulation, and deception. In order to be able to address these shortcomings and to evaluate the proper role, if any, of offsets in forest management, we must first understand how offsets work. Outlining the structure and potential of carbon offset trading is our primary goal today, with special emphasis on the rapidly developing global voluntary offset market. Though we have only time to scratch the surface of this complex question, our eminent panel has generously agreed to undertake the challenge. Today's panel, organized by the Juniper and Many Rivers groups of Oregon Sierra Club, will focus on how forest carbon offset markets operate and how they might be improved. Sierra Club is volunteer-driven with a commitment to the principles of diversity, justice, and grassroots democracy. If you would like to receive meetup notices for future Many Rivers or Juniper webinars, please put your email address in the Q&A for Sue Craig, Many Rivers Program Chair. Thank you for joining our distinguished panel of experts from the private, nonprofit, and scientific sectors uniquely qualified to provide insight into the complex, dynamic, and rather mysterious mechanisms of forest carbon offset markets. I'm Fergus McLean, Many Rivers Group's Conservation Chair. Please address your questions in the Q&A to Gretchen Valito, Chair of the Ben Juniper Group. We'll start by asking each panelist for a short presentation with a follow-up question or two, followed by several questions I prepared for the whole panel, and then we'll take your questions. Again, please address them in the Q&A to Gretchen. Our first speaker is Dr. Jerry Franklin, widely considered the Dean of U.S. Forest Ecology. Dr. Franklin co-authored the Northwest Forest Plan, which turned the forests of the Pacific Northwest from a carbon dioxide source to one of the world's greatest terrestrial carbon sinks. Dr. Franklin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fergus. I'd just like to begin by indicating that I'm talking about the classical Douglas fir hemlock forest of the west side of Oregon and Washington, and of course, adjacent British Columbia as well. I say that because the region of the northern spotted owl does include some areas of dry forest or frequent fire forest as well. But I'm talking about the classic moist forests of the west side. And it's the potential of this region is without parallel anywhere in the world. The potential of this region to sequester carbon is simply off the scale. It is far beyond the capabilities on a per hectare basis of what the tropical rainforest can do. And it's for a combination of reasons, but most profoundly, it's because of the character of the trees themselves, and their ability to live and grow for immense periods of time. And I won't even mention the redwoods in this regard, because they are even yet, again, off scale. The potential is tremendous to sequester carbon in this region. And there's just no question that carbon credits could be a very powerful force in getting people to move more and more towards ecologically sound forest management, which is not really represented at all by the tradition of the current forest management, which has been clear-cut and plantations of Douglas fir. The key here is that both carbon sequestration and other ecological benefits go with longer rotations, managing forests on much longer rotations than is currently managed on most of the industrial forest lands. And given those long rotations, you have an ability to sequester immense amounts of carbon, at the same time benefit almost all of the other important forest values, such as watershed protection and provision of wildlife habitat. And the key to it really is the potential for people, organizations, companies to try to game the carbon markets. And you can see that going on already on Wall Street, where you see slick brochures about how the current activities are doing such a great job at sequestering carbon. And interestingly, one of them that I've been exposed to makes an explicit point that don't pay any attention to the amount of carbon sequestered per hectare. That's not an important measure. And of course, it is the most critical measure of how well you are sequestering carbon in the forest. And so the metric that you want to be looking at is how you are affecting the long-term carbon storage per hectare in the forest. And just to provide you with a very simple comparison, if you take the old growth forests that we have and we still have some of them in the Northwest, and they should be left alone. They should not be harvested in any way. They typically would have somewhere in the range of 350 to 400 metric tons per hectare of sequestered carbon. Probably on the TIMO and REIT lands, the Timber Investment Management Organizations and the Real Estate Investment Trusts, with their very short rotations, which is because their goal is to maximize capital return on their investments, probably have less than 10% of that level of carbon storage on their lands. And what they would like to do is very much be paid for doing what they're doing right now. And so whatever kind of a program we have, we need it to be as ironclad as we can possibly make it, that it really involves true additionality, that it is long-term, and that it is monitored to see, in fact, the terms of the long-term contracts are made. So I'll leave at that point.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. You are an icon of academic forestry. You're in touch with progressive foresters. Are there academic programs that are addressing these questions? Are there academic gatekeepers? Is there any movement toward that? Or is there any unanimity in academia about how to improve what we've got?
Is there a consensus? No, I think that you will find that in academia there are distinctly two different schools of thought, and one is very traditional and very oriented towards classic timber production, and this is very characteristic of the southeastern schools, for example. I think you see in the Northwest, California, the Northeast, more and more emergence of programs that are focused on what I would call ecological forestry concepts, managing forests, not just for timber production, but in fact, managing them to sustain all of the values. As I like to talk about it, managing the forest to sustain their integrity. So I think we see a real movement that way. One of the weaknesses in the academic programs that emphasize that is that probably they don't receive enough training in the active management of forests and silviculture. And silviculture is unfortunately most traditional in a traditional profession. And so that's been much slower to change than perhaps the profession as a whole has been. But the key, again, is that the most productive lands in the Douglas fir region are in the hands of organizations who manage them fundamentally to maximize return on capital. And that's something we can change, but we have to be very careful. The system is not gamed in favor of paying them for doing essentially nothing in the way of carbon sequestration.
Thank you. We'll hopefully come back to that. Next, we'll hear from Lori Wayburn, co-founder and president of Pacific Forest Trust. Pacific Forest Trust advises government on every level on forest policy. The trust played a central role in creation of the California Forest Carbon Offset Trading System and manages in trust over 100,000 acres of California and Oregon forests. Lori, please go ahead.
Thank you, Fergus. I appreciate the chance to be here. And Jerry, you're always a hard act to follow, but I'm going to share my screen and leverage the power of PowerPoint here. So, saviors or scams, the devilish details. As Jerry says, there's a lot of potential in carbon offsets, but what matters is how and the assumptions in the accounting. So I'm having a look, here we go. Pacific Forest Trust, our mission is to restore and conserve forests for all their values, leveraging sustainable timber harvest as a tool to restore and maintain forests for those values. So shall we say we're putting the forest back in forestry, and those values include habitat, watersheds, and importantly, climate, which we are speaking about tonight. As Fergus said, we actually have conserved about 360,000 acres, and we hold easements on about 110, and then we own or manage another 14,000 acres. I think it is well known, as Jerry was saying, that forests are the largest, safest, and most expandable carbon sink in the world. They're also extraordinarily multi-benefit and cost-effective as a solution in climate change. What is less well known is that despite the fact that forests cover a third of the Earth's land base, the loss and degradation of forests accounts for 40% or more of the excess human-caused CO2 in the atmosphere today. So we think of them as sinks, they're also sources. And yet, when we look at the IPCC curves, they project of what is happening to the atmosphere, and we are actually on a worse projection than the worst one here, which is the RCP 8.5. We have exceeded that. The only kind of safe future that is one that we really have some ability to envision is that of the green line. And there is no possible way that we can get to that green line without changing how we manage forests. So that is without changing our business as usual. The United States is actually part of this problem. Some of you may know or may not that we lose twice as much forest land to non-forest uses as we lose farmland to non-farm uses. And in fact, Oregon is actually part of this problem, because when you lose forests, you lose their carbon stores and their future sequestration. In Oregon alone, harvest removals were the single largest source of emissions compared to energy, transportation, residential, industrial, and agriculture. So it's really one of those things that we can do something about here at home. And that is why we like to look at a kind of three-legged stool approach to the climate change crisis. And it is not just ourselves, this is the National Academy of Sciences, really recognizing the essential role of forests in solving the climate crisis. It is not greenwashing, it's essential. That said, it's worth taking a moment to give some definitions. So the terms offsets and allowances are often not understood. And this comes from, as Fergus was saying, market terminology. And it actually comes from the cap and trade pollution markets that were first developed for nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxides in the Northeast. And this is coming from a regulatory approach where you put a cap on the emissions of these particular gases coming from specific entities. And getting to the cap is something that you could do through having pollution allowances. So there are auctions for allowances that you can purchase, and that allows you to emit a certain amount. Now, if you can't buy enough allowances, you can trade or purchase offsets to get to the kind of pollution target that you're required to get to. So the concept of offsets comes from that regulatory market perspective. And so allowances are how much you're allowed to emit. Offsets are if you can't get there through either purchasing allowances from others or meeting it directly, and you have to work with a sector that is outside your own sector to do that. In the carbon market, forests are outside any cap. Now, Oregon is not yet a capped system. California is a capped system. Washington has just become a capped system. The regional greenhouse gas states are capped. But forests are outside of any capped system. One of the things that's really important to notice in this little diagram is there's only one arrow that goes from the atmosphere into the earth. All the other arrows go out. And so you can see the classic fossil fuel sector, but this acknowledges that forests themselves can be emitting sectors. Obviously, the harvest, the milling, manufacturing, and the decay of waste are also emissions that come from forests. So one of the things that I have learned is that people may confuse the price of allowances. So for example, in California, the price for the last allowance was almost $20 a ton, but offsets trail the allowance prices. So offsets are currently more in the 16, 17 plus dollars per ton. As Jerry was saying, one of the most important things here is to look at the additionality of what you are doing and the integrity of what you are doing. It's important to realize that a ton of CO2 pollution, which is what you allow when you have an offset, lasts a very long time. As you can see from this graph, even at 100 years, which is what the UN recommends and which its standard in California is and in the Greenhouse Gas Initiative states is, you still have almost 40% of that ton still in the atmosphere. So what's really important to recognize is if you're allowing a ton of pollution that's going to last that long, you should at least try to offset it for that long or discount it to reflect its relative value. The other thing that is very important is, as we know in forests, you shouldn't manage for just one thing. You don't want to manage for just timber. You don't want to manage for just carbon. You want to manage for the forest overall. So offset characteristics need to be additional to business as usual. They need to be measurable. They need to be verified by an independent third party. And in that measurability, you want transparency of how they are being measured. Some of you may remember that famous phrase of Ronald Reagan, once president of the United States. He said, trust, but verify. So an independent third-party verifier is really essential to that. And that you're working with the forest as a whole, and forests are more than trees. Lastly, we really need to look to resilience. And as we've all seen in our forests recently, a lot of them are not resilient. They haven't been managed for that kind of natural integrity. That resilience, as we continue to see climate change, such as the scorch in Oregon last year, the rain bombs that we've had, it's critically important. One of the challenges that we face in the Pacific Northwest, as Jerry was saying, these forests are 10 to 12 times as productive as those in the tropical areas. This is an old growth stump on lands that we manage in Oregon. And this is a relatively large tree that you see next to it. Old trees store more carbon than young trees. Old forests store more carbon than young forests. And getting back to that takes a lot of time. Additionally, there are features in natural forests of way they store carbon that are different than what is generally accepted on industrially managed lands. So all forests do store carbon, and we want all kinds of forests. Little trees may grow faster, such as that little sapling that you see, or actually it's a seedling in the lower photo there. Big trees may grow more slowly, but you can see that as you add carbon on the outer ring of a big tree, you're adding a lot more carbon than on the outer ring of a little tree. So it's really critical to recognize that offsets cannot be business as usual. Then you're not offsetting anything. You're simply contributing to the current situation. This is a generalized curve that gives a sense of what we mean by this. Most forests are being harvested really down in that lower left-hand corner, well before they're reaching what we used to call the culmination of mean annual increment. And in order to get to the point where you're really optimizing what those trees can do in terms of packing on carbon, well, time is money. So you need to pay for that time. And that is what changes the business as usual. Forest landowners are being managed under market forces, so we need to change that. This is an example of a forest in Oregon that we manage, the Van Eck forests. And you can see the blue line is the modeling of our carbon. It rather resembles that of the slide you just saw a moment ago, as compared to typical rotations on a 30-year basis. We harvest every year. We take about 2 million board foot a year off those off those lands. And yet this is the kind of growth that we're getting even so. Fergus asked a question of me when he invited me on this panel. I said, well, do people still work on those forests? And the answer is yes, they do. They are some of the creatures that benefit from the forest. These are some of the other ones. And I'd like to say thank you from myself and from this young elk on our Van Eck forests. And I'm happy to take a question or so from you, Fergus, if you'd like.
Thanks, Lori. Lori, you were in Glasgow at COP26, and would you mind repeating what you mentioned about the prices in the relative markets?
What I said about Glasgow, about prices and markets here today.
No, I'm sorry. What are the prices of voluntary versus California regulatory prices today?
Well, this is a really big distinction, and there's a huge range, absolutely huge range of voluntary. Because you are in a voluntary market, you don't have the kind of standards or transparency that you have in a regulatory market. And not all of those things are readily transparent. I'm aware of voluntary credits that go in the $1 to $4 a ton range. The current price on the compliance markets is more 16 to 17. But voluntary market pricing is quite volatile. It's voluntary. Whereas a regulated market has a cap and a collar, as they say. There's a floor to those prices and there's a ceiling to those prices, and you can only work within those.
I just saw a quote from the Financial Times that they gave a price in the voluntary market of $14.40, that those prices had tripled in the second half of 2021. Going back to Glasgow, I believe there was a lot of discussion of the voluntary markets there. Can you fill us in a little bit on what you learned?
Sure. And it is also important to note the difference between the European markets and the domestic markets, because all of Europe has a cap. And there's a very different approach there than there is within the US. So I think what you're talking about in Glasgow is in all of the COPs that I've been to since the early 2000s, the role of forests has been, mentioned, but never as prominently as here in this last year. It was clearly acknowledged that this was, shall we say, the lowest hanging fruit, to mix our metaphors of forests and fruit, and something that could be done globally. That the immediacy of addressing forest loss and degradation is something that we can make an immediate difference in. At the same time, there was an acknowledgement that our crisis in biodiversity loss, with 1 million species on the brink, is absolutely linked to climate change and forest loss as well. So you really can address 3 things at once when you do that. That said, at this conference, there was a huge cry for private finance to help jumpstart action. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is it's a very long process for governments to allocate money in general. It's a long and political process. So when you want to jumpstart activity, having private markets help is very useful. And the other is, in financial markets, there's a wonderful phrase about all the capital sloshing around on the sidelines. There's a lot of money waiting to be invested. And so this has become an area that's really quite popular to invest in. I think one of the critical issues that was brought up in Glasgow as well is that we cannot plant our way out of this issue. We need to work with standing forests. Tree planting has a role, but it is not the most critical nor the most immediate role. The most critical and immediate role that is identified, and is true in the US, is conserving the existing forests and managing to be older. In the US, we only have 20% of our forest sinks that are actually in any protected status.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Julia Grant, manager of Oregon's largest carbon project for Green Diamond Resources, a diversified natural resource firm with a commitment to high standards of sustainability. Julia is Green Diamond's Director of Policy, Partnerships, and Sustainability. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you, Fergus. Everyone can see that screen? Yes, thanks, Lori. It's fun to get to go after Jerry and Lori, people who I have looked up to in my forestry career, the last 20 years of my forestry career, and then actually get to be on a panel with you all today. So a little bit about this, this presentation. Let me see here. Did it move ahead? There we go. Okay. So I want to talk about who we are, who Green Diamond is. I've been with Green Diamond for just under a year, but I've been in the forestry and land conservation realm for the last 20 years. So who we are, what trends we're seeing in this carbon credit space, a couple examples of projects that we're involved with, and then how we go about, or not just us, but others, go about buying and selling these carbon credits. So Green Diamond was founded in Washington as the Simpson Timber Company in 1890, and the company has been privately held for 130 years. Our guiding principles are: we think and act in the long term, we invest where we can add value, and we want to be great in the woods. Operationally, we want to be known as outstanding foresters and caretakers of these lands. And all of these principles have led us to expand our business ventures from traditional forest management for timber to compliance grade carbon projects. We operate in 9 states. So in Washington, California, Oregon, and Montana, we own and manage 1.6 million acres of land as Green Diamond Resource Company. And then in Washington, Oregon, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, and Arkansas, we just manage the 650,000 acres of land as Green Diamond Management Company on behalf of a joint venture called Twin Creek Timber. And many of you maybe heard of our most recent acquisition in conjunction with Twin Creek Timbers. It was the former SDS lands that are in the Columbia Gorge. So it went from one family ownership to another family ownership. Well, it was partly in partnership with the Conservation Fund as well. They bought some of those acres, and then Twin Creek Timbers bought the other. So here are a few headlines from some recent news articles about trends in the carbon offset market. The first one being voluntary carbon markets rocket in 2021, on track to break $1 billion for the first time. And that speaks to some information that's gathered annually by the Ecosystem Marketplace's annual report. And that's something I guess I would encourage you. I always find it really interesting read. And you can go out there, and it's accessible for any of you all as well. And it's released each fall. And that report mentions that companies are not only the only ones buying these carbon credits. There are speculators out there as well, with plans to resell those carbon credits as the price of them go up. And that carbon credit project developers and brokers are struggling to keep up with the demand. They are finding, it's a real challenge right now for all the buyers out there to find enough credits for what they want to use them for. So that second headline, carbon offsets are taking off, but are they all created equal? That kind of hits on the whole theme of our discussion today. It highlights how voluntary and compliance protocols, there's a number of protocols out there, and the rigidity of those various protocols have been called into question at times. And then that third headline, the carbon offset market could be worth $200 billion by 2050. What is this market? It speaks to the growing need for carbon offsets as a result of corporate sustainability goals, science-based target initiative, net zero commitments. So that's making this carbon offset business a massive potential business. And the primary markets for selling these carbon credits are energy, consumer goods, finance, and insurance sectors. But all of these stories send a signal to someone like us, a forest landowner, that carbon credits are here to stay. They might evolve over time, but they're here to stay. And so Green Diamond, we are growing our portfolio to participate in this maturing marketplace. Now for a couple examples of projects. So Green Diamond is drawn to the more rigorous nature of the California Air Resources Board, the ARB compliance protocol, especially because it relates to the thing, or it speaks more highly to the things that Dr. Franklin was talking about: additionality, permanence, leakage. We were around at the turn of the last 2 centuries, and we intend to be around at the turn of the next century. So signing up for a compliance grade carbon project, which is a 100-year commitment, that really doesn't scare us. We take the long view. Another reason we choose these compliance protocols is because there are lots of war stories out there and questionable carbon credits. And we want to stay as far from that fray as possible, and want to be in these durable carbon markets and want people to have faith in us as a producer of those carbon credits. Lori spoke to the issue of the various pricing of the voluntary and the compliance grade carbon. And yes, that compliance grade carbon, the pricing on it really appeals to us. But we have found, I mean, of all the carbon credits that we have sold, we have not sold them to any compliance buyers. We have sold them to voluntary buyers who want compliance grade carbon. So we currently have 4 developed projects, 1 in California, 1 in Alabama, and 2 in Southern Oregon. And we're in the development stage of 1 in Montana. So up on this slide, I have a map of the Southern Oregon projects. We have 2 around Klamath Falls. In 2014, Green Diamond purchased 630,000 acres in that South Central Oregon area. Very young trees that had been heavily hit by harvest by the previous landowner. And we want to grow that forest. We want to grow it older, bigger trees, and there's really no cash flows. There are very little cash flows on that forest currently. So like Lori says, using carbon credits to get yourself to longer rotations, bigger trees, that's how we are using them on that forest. And we have these 2 improved forest management projects in that area, Klamath East and Klamath West. And we sold some of our first compliance grade carbon credits in 2018 there. Last summer, you may recall there was a fire that started on the federal forest lands, and it blew over to Green Diamond lands, and it burned across the Klamath East carbon project. And so a portion of that project is burned. And we are in a waiting game right now to find out what that status will be of that project going forward. We'll have to do some more monitoring and verification this coming summer before we'll know the answer on that. And then the Montana project in 2021, we purchased 300,000 acres in Northwest Montana. And now Green Diamond is the largest private forest landowner in the state of Montana. And this is a forest of native species, very similar to Oregon. It has a lot of young trees. And our initial assessment is that it's going to be a good candidate for a carbon project. But these doing all the inventory and processing of the credits takes a while. I mean, it's going to take a year plus. So our hope is that we will be able to offer verified carbon credits on that property maybe sometime late in 2023. And once we have plans for like 3 different projects. The first project can come online next year. And once fully developed, we estimate between 200 and 300,000 metric tons of CO2 each year being those credits being able to be sold. So then finally, my last slide I have, it's some of the different ways that carbon credits are being bought and sold. And I just wanted to walk through these a little bit. And what I think is really interesting about this is that none of these options are the ways that we have sold our carbon credits. We have found that people who are looking for rigorous, high integrity carbon credits will go to the registry, will go to the ARB registry and look for the kind of project that they want to be associated with when they buy their carbon credits. And then they'll find us, track us down, and give us a call. So it will be a really one-on-one transaction. But wanted to mention these. So Element Markets, which recently merged with Blue Source, and Blue Source is a developer and seller of carbon credits. They now have this, as a whole, they have this global decarbonization platform with the intent to develop and sell forest carbon credits, emission credits, renewable energy credits. So they see themselves as more an aggregate of a variety of different kinds of credits. The next one down, Carbon Fund and 3 Degrees and Terra Carbon, those are 3 different organizations. They are all companies focused on developing global forest carbon projects and selling those associated carbon credits. And then Finite Carbon is similar to the organizations above, but its focus is on US only projects. One you may not have heard of, but it's a pretty interesting one is ICE. That's short for the Intercontinental Exchange, and Intercontinental Exchange owns the New York Stock Exchange. And this ICE has this global experiences in auctions, such as gas storage, silver and gold, and EU emissions. And they are planning to launch a platform in 2022 around auctioning these credits, because they feel like that will help drive some transparency and drive up the prices as well. Carbon streaming is the final one I have on the list, and it is focused on acquiring, managing, and growing high quality and diversified portfolios of investments that generate voluntary and compliance grade carbon credits. So it's really funded by investors and companies who want to have this diversification of carbon projects. And there's others out there, but I didn't want to crowd this slide too much. So like everyone here, I really appreciate being involved in this, and thank you for your time. And I look forward to the conversations that we're going to have.
Thank you so much, Julia. That is incredibly impressive. A key element, it seems like, is the longevity of your timeline at Green Diamond, because what I don't hear really talked about in valuing carbon offsets is that when you sell the offsets, you get the revenue, but then at the end of the period, you have all that timber and it's yours, and it's much more valuable than it was at the beginning. So is that not true?
Well, I would say, Lori can speak to this too. It all depends on where your markets, what's going on with the markets. So if, what's going on with the local mills, what kind of trees are feeding that local mill? I think over time, we will, depending on the landscape and depending on where these carbon projects are placed on the landscape, you might see different kinds of milling facilities show up that can handle larger trees that produce different kinds of products than mills that are producing products from smaller diameter trees. Lori, you want to speak to that?
Please, Lori.
Sure. I think one of the most important things that you're raising here is that the carbon is stored in aggregate on the landscape. In other words, it's not all in one tree. You're looking at stands. And so on average, the age of the stands is getting older. And with the compliance rigor that Julia is pointing out, you have the guarantee that on average, each of those tons is going to be there for 100 years. So it's rolling across the landscape. Each year that you sell a ton, it's got to be there for another 100 years. So effectively what you're doing, Fergus, is you are having a perpetual cycle with that 100-year commitment. So you are growing an older forest. You still harvest trees, just as we still harvest trees. One of the most limiting factors in our forests is too much competition of too many straws in the ground, too many trees to the acre. What we want is fewer trees to the acre that are bigger and are more resilient for a variety of reasons. So I don't really foresee when you work with a compliance. So if you want to voluntarily buy offsets, such as what Green Diamond's offsets are being purchased by the voluntary market, but they know, the consumer knows and the producer knows that those carbon gains are going to effectively be rolling on forever. The challenge with voluntary markets, so with voluntary projects, these are not compliance grade projects, these are voluntary projects, is they don't have that same rigor. The other thing that Julia pointed out was they had a fire. Fires happen. The compliance market has a built-in buffer pool. So it has built-in insurance. In other words, they are holding in reserve tons to be released to the market to replace those that are lost to disaster. And one of the most interesting things about the buffer within the California compliance market is that it's got enough reserves to keep paying out for another at least 100 years. So the number of fires that we've had aren't making a dent in that buffer pool. In other words, the buyer of a compliance grade offset has the assurance of knowing that fire is not going to be a factor that loses the carbon that they paid to have sequestered.
So you're
That's
saying
really important.
So you're saying there is no buffer in the voluntary market?
There's very few of the voluntary ones that have buffers. And they also don't have the kind of trading protection that you have within the compliance market. There's a kind of Securities and Exchange Commission function in those compliance markets.
Okay, all you critics of carbon offsets, you better check that one out, because that's a real flaw in the voluntary market.
Am I right, Lori, the European market does have built into it a buffer?
Right, and it is a compliance market.
Yes.
That's the important thing. And one of the reason that you heard my hesitation there, Fergus, is that what the compliance markets have is a buffering across all of the offset types. And that's really important. There may be diversification of forest types within voluntary markets, but they don't cover methane. They don't cover refrigerants. There's a real variety, and that diversity, because CO2 is a global gas from many sources, as we saw, that diversity is really important. So I'm not aware that any voluntary market that has that kind of diversity or scale in terms of the buffer. Julia may have a sense of any of them having even a marginal buffer.
Panelists, it's clear that this topic is far too complex to even begin to approach in an hour. We'd better go to our questions if we're going to have any participation. What do you got for us, Gretchen?
Okay. Is there a danger that younger trees forests will be cut more if limits on old growth? That doesn't seem to make sense. Is there a danger that younger trees forest will be cut more if limits on old growth, if there are limits on old growth? Who would
I think
like to?
that's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next question.
All right. Why does the discussion of carbon sequestration not start with the sequestration of an intact old growth forest? Then hold accountable anyone who takes away the initial sequestration accountable, rather than counting carbon into the future with plantations. Is this a fatally flawed economic and ecological analysis?
So
Well,
I would suggest that the fundamental difference for this person is that actually in the compliance market, that difference is accounted for. So it's because it's against a business as usual approach, which Jerry was talking about. That's that short rotation forestry. If you have an old forest and you decide not to cut it, that is different than business as usual. And there is a standard methodology for inventorying it, measuring it, and determining how much you have to gain. So that is the way to value the contribution of those older forests, if there is something like that.
Great. This question is directed to Dr. Franklin. Does timber salvage after wildfires have an impact on carbon sequestration?
I would say, of course it does. And again, I would have to make a distinction between moist forests, which have infrequent fire, and dry forests and frequent fire landscapes. And in the case of, for example, the Douglas fir hemlock forest, a salvage is going to result in, I think, much more rapid loss of the carbon in the dead wood than if you salvage. Salvage is going to have a negative consequence, not just in terms of carbon sequestration, but in terms of carbon sequestration, as well as other factors. In the dry forests, where we want to practice kind of the prescribed burning, and we're dealing with forests often that have far more carbon in them right now than they had historically, there is often justification for going in and doing salvage. But in doing so, significant residual dead trees need to leave behind. And Norm Johnson and I developed the philosophy of do exactly what you would in a green forest, in the burn forest, in terms of what you leave behind. Take the younger trees, the smaller trees, the trees that are going to decay more rapidly, and leave behind the more decay resistant, larger diameter trees, because they're the ones you need, among other things, not just for carbon sequestration, but as wildlife habitat.
Great, thank you. How much will we gain by changing from clear cutting X number of hectares of forest on 80-year rotation versus clear cutting the same area on a 40-year rotation?
It's like the difference between black and white.
Mhm.
The short rotations sequester very, very little carbon. And I won't get into the controversy over, how much of the timber goes into long-term storage products as opposed to short-term products, and how much is waste. But as far as what's out there on the ground, it's absolutely unquestionable that in a short rotation plantation, let's say 40-year plantation of Douglas fir, you're going to have probably a third or a quarter of the carbon sequestered per hectare as you would in an 80-year rotation. And it would probably only be 10 or 15% of what would be stored in an old growth forest. So sequestration is inconsequential under the short rotation management being practiced on a lot of industrial forest lands in Western Oregon.
Thank you.
Then here a little, because I have to be also very careful about the fact we can't have all carbon storage projects across the landscape. I mean, we have, we demand, you and I, we all demand wood products. And, you know, if we lock up too many forests in carbon projects, then you're going to go to concrete and more steel, and we will see worse implications for our climate.
Julia,
So there's this very happy medium place. We aren't there yet, but I think there's this happy medium place.
I agree with you completely, and I don't advocate setting aside any of the lands that are currently being active managed. I would simply alter the nature of that active management, and it would include sustained economic returns. So I just want to be very clear. The only thing that I've worked hard to see reserved are the naturally regenerated mature and old forests, which are all on federal lands. And I don't even advocate shutting off the federal lands. I think the forests that have been previously harvested on federal and state lands, for the most part, need to continue to be managed, particularly under climate change.
Lori.
Hey, this person is asking, what is the difference between carbon?
Gretchen, Lori had her hand up.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
The one thing that I would add here is I frankly think that the notion of carbon reserves is a bit of a red herring, Julia, because as you and I know, the 98% of forest carbon projects are what are called improved forest management. So these are lands that stay and harvest, but actually what we're doing in those carbon projects yields more timber as well as more carbon.
Amen.
So this is what is critical to realize. It's the beauty of managing forests as opposed to simply for fiber. And I think market pressure has driven the development of fiber products because we didn't have the saw timber out on the land anymore. So this is a way of paying for the time to rebuild the principal volume on these lands that can hold them. And I think, as Jerry is pointing out, some lands really make sense to manage for those longer rotations and higher carbon stocks that they can naturally carry. Other lands, such as our interior forests, we put a lot more timber onto those lands than what was there before because they were low competition forests and frequent fire forests. So we have unnaturally carbon dense interior forests that are very subject to pests, to drought, to fire. And so we really need to rebalance this, but it is not a matter, nobody is talking about stopping harvest and the yield of timber products. We are actually talking about increasing, shall we say, the optionality of that timber harvest.
I always like to point out Douglas fir is not a sprinter, it's a long distance runner. And if you want to optimize Douglas fir, you have to live with it longer. But Wall Street can't tolerate that because their goal is not to maximize wood production. Their goal is to maximize return on capital. And so to do that, they cut off the Douglas fir at the knees rather than letting it to really produce what it can.
Thank you. This person wants to know, what is the difference between conifer and deciduous tree carbon sequestration?
One moment before we proceed, we're at our time limit, but Pilk has informed us that we can run over. So thank you for joining us, those who have to leave, and proceed, Gretchen.
Okay.
In principle, the deciduous hardwoods, for the most part, undergo much more rapid decay. They do not have the decay-resistant heartwoods that are characteristic of many of the evergreens. For example, Douglas fir, and of course, most extraordinary ways, redwood and giant sequoia, which almost don't decay at all. You got to burn them up. They don't go away otherwise. And so red cedars, the cedars are all wonderful in terms of producing decay-resistant hardwood. Mostly the hardwoods are very much more rapid in terms of their decay rate after they die.
The only thing that I would amend there, Jerry, is that really depends on what system you're in. You know, the eastern oaks can be very, very long-lived.
Sure.
Same is true for oaks in California and other states. So compared within the Oregon system, outside of the oaks in the Willamette Valley, which share the same characteristics of being very long-lived, but they're relatively few of them to the acre. And that you may have been talking just about the the system of the Pacific Northwest, but
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
And also let me just say a couple of real advantages of the deciduous hardwoods. They're less flammable and they make incredible wildlife trees. Nothing better than California black oak tree for wildlife habitat.
Julia, do you have any deciduous in your carbon
Yeah,
project?
our project in California is a deciduous project.
Great, thank you. This is a rather complicated question, but I think we'll get there. A few years ago, Oregon State University's carbon offsets through Bonneville Environmental Foundation were directed to an Oregon forest that agreed to be paid to cutting less often. However, the parent corp could sell logs through a different subsidiary to compensate. Would any of these certifications prevent this oversight? And they've listed about 5 here. ACR, American Carbon Registry, CAR, Carbon Action Reserve, GS, Gold Standard, and VCS, Verified Carbon Standard. And he says this forest was removed from BEF's list the next year.
Julia, do you want to take that or should I?
I am not familiar with that one. I won't touch that one.
So the basic question here is the one of leakage. And the idea is that an owner who has multiple subsidiaries puts a carbon project in one, and they want to get paid for that, but they're going to keep their volume removal up in the other. So they want to get paid for effectively twice. And it doesn't have the atmospheric benefit because you're creating as much emission as you are avoiding. And leakage analysis is absolutely required under the compliance system. So there's a big difference here between the system and the registry. So the California Air Resources Board system has a number of registries that can provide projects to it if they meet those requirements. So the best way to know that the project that you're working with has had that leakage analysis and has prevented effective leakage from occurring is to get a compliance grade offset, no matter what registry it comes from. ACR is listed on the California system. These all can have listings there. So what matters is the integrity of the system under which that registry is working.
The devil in the details.
Exactly.
This person asks, do we need some form of government support to initiate any effort toward carbon sequestration, forest or otherwise, in order to engage the financial commercial sector a bit down the road? At this time, engaging the financial commercial sector is similar to investing in startups and is pretty risky.
Like one for you, Julia.
I think Lori was going to say something, but I would say no. I would say that we are seeing the market change. We are seeing these voluntary commitments that companies are making, and they aren't doing that. They aren't being pressured by any government to do that. They are deciding that they want to contribute what they can to the reduction of climate change. And so they view this as a mitigation opportunity, and that's why they seek these carbon credits.
What I would add to what Julia is saying and how I hear that question is a little different. And that is, there are government-backed rating programs for things which are voluntary in nature. So think of the Energy Star program for your refrigerator, or think of your mileage rating when you go to buy a car. Those are government-backed standards. And you have many different options about where you will decide to fall with your product in that standard, but it's a fundamental consumer protection measure. It's a fundamental public benefit transparency measure to have a rating system, not that sets the standards, but allows you to see where you fall. So for example, what it would do here is that it would identify what kind of permanence or durability that voluntary compliance offset had, what kind of third-party verification system that voluntary offset had. It would give the consumer the confidence to know if they wanted to buy a short-term ton that wasn't verified, that had no clear basis of methodology that was shared and peer-reviewed, they could do that. Nobody prevents you from buying a junk car. Nobody prevents you from buying a junk bond, but it is your decision that you're going to buy a junk bond. So I think that's where there's a role for government at this juncture in the offset market, and where some support could go is to establishing that rating system.
Yeah, I might also add that providing access to small landowners, family forests, is definitely going to take some kind of government intervention. They're just too unwieldy.
Well, there are a number of organizations, a number of these forest carbon developers. Finite is one of them that has figured out a way to aggregate a number of smaller forest landowners in a certain region to share costs and to create a whole project.
Yeah, and that's allowed under the compliance system as well, Fergus. Aggregation is an opportunity that is there for small landowners who decide that they want to work together that way.
How about one more question, Gretchen?
Okay, and this is directed to the whole panel. We clearly need forests to be managed for resiliency and sequestration. I understand the value of offsets, providing a price signal for that. But we need that and very rapid greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and especially to leave fossil fuels in the ground where they stay for tens of thousands of years rather than 100 or more years. A forest offset, offsets are being used to justify more extraction and use of fossil fuels. Also, studies show that you need to remove more than 1 ton of carbon to offset the climate effect of 1 ton of emissions. Please comment generally. Given all of this, wouldn't conservation financing be preferable to funding protection through offsetting?
Well, I'm happy to start with that question. As Fergus mentioned, the work that we did in California is what got forests included within the California climate policy. And the entry point was offsets. But offsets are the tail of the dog. The dog is how we manage forests broadly for climate. Carbon is a commodity. Timber is a commodity. Those are market benefits and market signals. But I agree with the person in this question. It is but one tool in the toolbox. It absolutely cannot be the only tool in the toolbox. If we are hoping to make a dent in this next 8 years that we have at this juncture to change the trajectory of climate change. I think if we are going to say it is only a market-based system that will drive this change in a time that will make the difference, we are misguided. We've got to have other tools in the toolbox. It's why, for example, within the state of California, Over $4 billion of public money has been driven to what's called the natural and working land sector to do the kinds of restoration and conservation that we have to do. So we're going to have public investment as well as private investment. It can't rest on offsets alone.
Jerry or Julia? Don't want to take that one?
That's a good closure.
Amen to that. Amen
All right.
to what Laurie said. We can't do this with a single tool. What craziness? You know, the capital markets are not going to solve the problem for us by themselves, period. So.
And yet, as Julia pointed out, the system's here to stay. It's not like we're going to decide whether to do this or not. It's happening. It's how we're going to work with it. Well, thank you, panel. Julia, so interesting business model, selling the highest quality offsets into the voluntary market. Jerry, your new book, Ecological Forest Management, marks a new era in the training of professional foresters. Laurie, you're leading the way in forest policy. We're so honored to have you all with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jack.
No problem. Take care.
Bye.